Jalen couldn't stop glancing at his phone, not for messages, but for the time. This was it. His first trip alone. His first real taste of independence. The thought sent a rush of excitement through his chest. The night before, he had packed everything carefully: boarding pass, ID, wallet, phone charger. His mother had drilled him with last-minute reminders. Text me when you land. Keep your bag close. Don't talk to strangers. He had rolled his eyes, laughing. Mom, I got this. Now, standing inside Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, he felt the weight of it all. No parents hovering, no one reminding him to zip his backpack or double-check his flight details. Just him and the open sky ahead. Jalen adjusted the strap of his duffel bag as he weaved through the crowd. The airport buzzed with energy, families reuniting, businessmen speed-walking with rolling suitcases, the intercom crackling with flight announcements. He took it all in, feeling grown up. At the check-in kiosk, he tapped through the prompts easily. Confirm flight. Select seat. Print boarding pass. A one-way ticket to Seattle, just for the weekend to visit his cousin. His mom had booked it for him like she always did for family trips. He hadn't thought much about it until now. As the printed boarding pass slid out, Jalen grabbed it and turned, only to notice a woman behind the counter watching him. Mid-40s, blonde bob, pale skin. Her eyes flicked from him to the kiosk screen and back, her lips pressing into a thin line. Jalen hesitated, then shrugged it off. Maybe she's just checking the machine. Slinging his bag over his shoulder, he headed for TSA security. The line moved quickly. He ran through the mental checklist his mom had drilled into him. Shoes off. Laptop out. Liquids separate. A little girl in front of him tugged her dad's sleeve. Daddy, why do we take our shoes off? Jalen smiled as the dad chuckled. Because they want to make sure our feet aren't made of bombs. The girl giggled, and Jalen let his shoulders relax. Everything was normal. His turn came. He placed his bag in the bin, removed his hoodie, and stepped through the scanner. Clear. He laced up his sneakers, exhaled, and checked the time. 15 minutes until boarding. Plenty of time. He found an empty seat near the window, stretching his legs. His cousin had already texted him. We're hitting the arcade when you land. Bet I still beat you at Street Fighter. Jalen smirked, typing back. Bet you don't. His stomach grumbled. He stood to grab something to eat, then stopped. The woman from check-in was back. And this time, she wasn't alone. A TSA officer stood beside her. And they were both looking straight at him. Jalen had always been told to trust the process, to follow the rules, and everything would be fine. But as he sat there in the Phoenix Sky Harbor terminal, feeling the weight of two sets of eyes burning into him, he knew that wasn't always true. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the way the check-in agent, blonde, mid-40s, with a sharp gaze, stood stiffly near the gate counter. The way her lips pressed together like she was holding on to a thought too tightly. The way the TSA officer beside her, a tall man with a squared jaw and a badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, kept glancing in his direction. Jalen wasn't the only one in the terminal. People were coming and going, scrolling through their phones, chatting over their coffees. But none of them were being watched the way he was. A tightness built in his chest. He turned back to his phone, forcing himself to focus on something, anything else. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe they're just handling something completely unrelated. Then the TSA officer nodded. The woman pointed at him. Jalen's stomach twisted. His pulse picked up speed as the officer started toward him, his strides measured, purposeful. "This isn't nothing." Jalen sat up straighter, fingers tightening around his phone. He felt the creeping sense of unease coil around him like a shadow. The officer stopped right in front of him. His stance wasn't aggressive, but it carried authority, the kind that made people listen, the kind that made it clear that whatever was about to happen wasn't up for debate. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said. "I need to ask you a few questions." Jalen blinked. His mouth felt dry. "Okay." The check-in woman moved in closer, standing just behind the officer with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The officer glanced at Jalen's boarding pass. His voice was firm but neutral. "Where are you headed today?" The question seemed harmless enough. But something about the way he asked it made Jalen's gut tell him otherwise. "Seattle," Jalen answered, careful to keep his tone even. The officer nodded slightly. "Traveling alone?" Jalen's jaw tightened. He felt the woman's stare pressing into him like a second interrogation. "Yeah." The officer studied him for a long moment before asking, "Who booked your ticket?" Jalen frowned. "What kind of question is that?" "My mom," he said, now glancing between the officer and the woman, trying to read their expressions. The check-in woman exhaled softly, almost like she had just confirmed a suspicion she had been waiting to prove. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Your mother booked your ticket?" Jalen frowned deeper. "Yeah. She always does." The officer didn't move to write anything down, didn't seem interested in verifying anything. He just kept watching Jalen, as if waiting for something. Jalen's fingers curled around his phone. His skin prickled with the weight of the moment. "Is there a problem?" he asked carefully. The woman spoke first. "We just want to make sure everything checks out." Jalen turned to her, confused. "Why wouldn't it?" She gave a polite but firm smile. "We have to be cautious with certain bookings." His stomach knotted tighter. Jalen's voice was calm, but his frustration was beginning to surface. "Certain bookings?" The officer didn't look away. "We just need to verify that this ticket actually belongs to you." Jalen let out a slow, controlled breath. "You can check my ID. It matches the name on the ticket." The officer didn't ask for it. Instead, he glanced at the woman again. Jalen followed his gaze. She wasn't even pretending anymore. She didn't believe him. Jalen had seen that look before. It was the same one he had gotten at stores when security guards watched him a little too closely. The same one he had received at school when a teacher questioned whether he had really completed an assignment on his own. The look that said, "I don't think you belong here." His grip tightened around his phone. "I don't get it," Jalen said slowly. "Why are you only asking me these questions?" The officer hesitated, but the woman didn't. "Your reservation was flagged as irregular." Jalen's shoulders tensed. "Irregular how?" he asked, his voice controlled but firm. The woman's smile didn't waver. "Your name didn't match the payment method on file." Jalen stared at her. "Because my mom booked it for me," he said flatly. The officer said nothing. A couple of nearby passengers had started to glance over, their attention subtly shifting toward the conversation. Jalen could feel their curiosity prickling against his skin. He inhaled sharply through his nose. "So, you're saying I can't fly because my mom used her credit card?" The woman shook her head. "We didn't say you couldn't fly. We just need to confirm." Jalen didn't let her finish. "Then check with her." That stopped them both. The woman's mouth opened slightly, caught off guard. Jalen lifted his phone. "I can call her right now." The officer hesitated. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. Jalen didn't wait for their response. He swiped to his mom's number and hit dial. The phone rang once. Twice. Then his mother's voice came through, calm, confident. "Jalen." He swallowed hard. "Mom," he said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "They're saying my ticket is flagged because you booked it." A pause. Then, her tone shifted. Steady. Cold. "Put me on speaker." Jalen tapped the button. "This is Alicia Holloway," his mother's voice rang through the terminal, clear and unwavering. "I'd like to know why my son is being stopped in my airport." The woman paled. The officer stiffened. Jalen exhaled. Finally, the balance of power had shifted. But he knew this wasn't over yet. Alicia Holloway had spent years perfecting the art of control. She had learned that power wasn't always in raising your voice, it was in knowing exactly when and how to use it. And right now, she was about to use it. Her son had called her, his voice steady but edged with frustration. She had listened carefully, piecing together what was happening even before he finished explaining. They had stopped him. Questioned him. Treated him like a suspect. For nothing. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but her voice stayed calm, cold. "Put me on speaker," she had instructed. Now, her voice rang through the terminal. "This is Alicia Holloway," she said, her tone smooth but sharp. "And I'd like to know why my son is being stopped in my airport." The pause that followed was brief but heavy. Jalen sat there, gripping his phone, watching the shift happen in real time. The woman, Rebecca Langley, as he would soon learn, visibly stiffened. The TSA officer, Daniel Rhodes, adjusted his stance. They had walked into this situation thinking they were in control, but now, they weren't so sure. Langley recovered first. "Ma'am," she began, her voice forced into professional politeness, "this is just a routine security check." Alicia didn't hesitate. "Routine," she repeated, the word laced with skepticism. "My son has valid ID, a boarding pass, and a flight booked in his name. What exactly needs to be checked?" Langley hesitated, glancing at Rhodes, who finally cleared his throat. His reservation was flagged. "For what reason?" Alicia interrupted. Rhodes shifted slightly. His name didn't match the payment method on file. Alicia closed her eyes for half a second. She wasn't surprised. She inhaled slowly, controlled. "Because I booked it," she said, her voice unwavering. A parent purchasing a ticket for their child is neither unusual nor suspicious. "So I'll ask again, why was his reservation flagged?" Langley opened her mouth, but no words came out. Alicia let the silence stretch, waiting. Jalen watched as the two officials struggled to find a justification. They had been so confident before. So sure that what they were doing was just part of procedure. But now, confronted by a woman who knew better, their certainty wavered. Langley finally spoke. "We're just verifying the legitimacy of the ticket," she said, but the words were weak now. Alicia's voice dropped lower. "Would you be asking these questions," she said, slow and deliberate, "if my son looked different? If his name were Jake or Matthew? If he had blue eyes and blonde hair?" Rhodes exhaled through his nose. "Ma'am, we're just following protocol," he said, but there was no confidence in it anymore. Alicia didn't even give him the benefit of a pause this time. "Then tell me," she said smoothly, "what protocol states that a minor flying on a ticket purchased by their parent is a security threat?" Silence. Alicia knew how to use silence. She let it sit, let them feel it. Let them realize that there was no good answer. She could hear the murmurs around them, feel the weight of other passengers now paying attention. She exhaled slowly. "I want your names," she said, her voice like steel. "Both of you." Langley's expression flickered, something between reluctance and irritation. "Miss Holloway, I don't think that's—" "I didn't ask what you thought," Alicia cut her off, not raising her voice, but making it clear there was no room for negotiation. "I asked for your names." Langley swallowed. "Rebecca Langley." Rhodes sighed, his jaw tightening. "Officer Daniel Rhodes." Alicia nodded, even though they couldn't see her. "And I want this documented," she continued. "A full report on why my son was stopped, who authorized it, and what protocol you were supposedly following. If I don't receive that within the hour, I will be making a few phone calls." Langley's face reddened. "That won't be necessary, Miss Holloway." Alicia's tone didn't shift. "Oh, it absolutely is," she said. "Because this doesn't go away." Jalen sat still, listening, his phone still raised. He had seen his mother in action before. Had seen her handle people who underestimated her, watched them realize, too late, that they had miscalculated. But this wasn't about a business deal. This was about him. And it stung in a way he hadn't expected. "Jalen," Alicia's voice softened slightly. "Are you okay?" He hesitated. His throat felt tight, but he forced a nod. "Yeah." A pause. Then, in a tone that left no room for argument, "You're still flying to Seattle." Langley opened her mouth again, but Alicia didn't give her the chance. "If he misses his flight," she said, her voice deceptively smooth, "I will make sure everyone involved remembers this moment for a very long time." Langley's jaw tightened. She knew she had lost. Rhodes exhaled sharply. "You're free to board your flight, sir." "Sir?" Now they wanted to be professional. Jalen stood, gripping his phone, his stomach still tight. He glanced at Langley. "So that's it," he said, his voice even but edged with something sharp. "I get questioned, pulled aside, treated like a suspect, and now I'm just free to go?" Langley blinked, like she hadn't expected him to challenge her. "There was a misunderstanding," she said. Jalen let out a dry laugh. "A misunderstanding." Alicia's voice cut through the moment. "Jalen." He turned toward the phone, and for the first time, he saw it. The worry in her voice, just beneath the surface. She didn't want him to push it. "Not here. Not now." Jalen swallowed his frustration and nodded. "All right." He adjusted his bag, the terminal suddenly feeling too open, too big. As he turned to walk toward his gate, Alicia spoke again. "Rebecca." Langley looked up sharply. Alicia tilted her head slightly. "You should rethink how you profile people." Langley's face flushed red. Jalen didn't look back. He just kept walking. He should feel relieved. The problem was solved. He was getting on his flight. But he didn't feel relieved. He felt tired. Jalen walked away from the TSA checkpoint, his boarding pass still clutched in his hand. His steps felt heavy, not from the weight of his duffel bag but from everything that had just happened. He should have felt relieved. He was getting on his flight. He wasn't being detained. His mother had stepped in, and just like that, the people who had looked at him with suspicion were now eager to let him go. But he didn't feel relieved. He felt tired. Not physically, though his body did feel weighed down. It was something deeper. A kind of exhaustion he had felt before, one that didn't come from running or staying up too late, but from being seen the wrong way. He reached his gate just as final boarding was called. The line had thinned out, and the agent at the counter barely glanced at his pass before scanning it and waving him through. Like nothing had happened. Like he was just another passenger. Jalen stepped onto the jet bridge, the air cooler than in the terminal. The distant hum of the plane's engines filled the space. He ran a hand over his face, trying to push the last 30 minutes out of his head. But it wasn't that easy. When he found his seat, he slid his bag under the chair in front of him and leaned back, exhaling. He pulled out his phone. A new message from his cousin Malik was waiting for him. "Yo, you good?" Jalen hesitated before typing back. "Yeah. Boarding now." Was that the truth? He wasn't sure. The plane filled with the quiet murmur of passengers settling in. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, helping people stow their bags. Someone a few rows ahead of him was already asleep, their head pressed against the window. Everything was normal. At least, for everyone else. Jalen twisted the cap off the water bottle he had picked up earlier, taking a slow sip. He kept his gaze on the seat in front of him, but his mind was still replaying what had just happened. Would Langley go back to work tomorrow and pretend it never happened? Would Rhodes? Or would they remember? Would they hesitate the next time they saw a young black teenager at the airport and assume the worst? Jalen sighed. Maybe. Maybe not. A quiet voice beside him pulled him out of his thoughts. "You good, kid?" Jalen turned. The man sitting next to him, maybe in his mid-50s, salt and pepper beard, reading glasses perched low on his nose, was looking at him. Not in a nosy way. Just curious. Jalen hesitated, then shrugged. "Yeah. Just tired." The man nodded like he understood. "You handled yourself well back there," he said. Jalen's stomach tightened. "You saw?" The man sighed, adjusting his glasses. "Saw enough." Jalen exhaled, running a hand down his face. He hadn't wanted an audience. The man set his book down. "That ever happened to you before?" Jalen thought about it. "Not exactly like that," he admitted. "But yeah." The man was quiet for a moment. Then, he let out a low chuckle. "Me too." Jalen blinked. "For real?" The man nodded. "For real." Something heavy settled between them. Jalen shook his head. "I wasn't even doing anything." "You never are," the man said simply. Jalen sighed. The man leaned back in his seat. "Let me ask you something. What do you think happens next?" Jalen frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," the man said, tilting his head slightly, "they made a mistake. A big one. And your mom," he let out a low whistle, "she wasn't playing around." Jalen smirked slightly. No, she wasn't." The man nodded. "So what happens next? You think they learn from it? Or do you think they just try not to get caught next time?" Jalen didn't answer right away. Because he wasn't sure. He wanted to believe that Langley would think twice before assuming the worst of someone just because of how they looked. That Rhodes would question the policies he followed without hesitation. But he also knew better. People didn't change overnight. The man sighed, tapping his fingers against his armrest. "You don't have to answer that. Just something to think about." Jalen chewed on the thought. What did happen next? He glanced down at his phone. A new message from his mom. "Call me when you land." She was still on edge. And he got it. If their roles had been reversed, if he had been the one sitting at home, waiting to hear if his mom was okay, he'd be just as worried. The plane began its descent into Seattle. The flight attendants made their final rounds, checking seatbelts and trays. Jalen looked out the window as the city came into view, lights stretching across the horizon. His trip was just beginning. But something told him what happened in Phoenix wasn't over. Not yet. And maybe that was a good thing. The moment Jalen stepped off the plane in Seattle, his phone buzzed. He didn't even have to check. He knew who it was. "Mom, call me when you land." Jalen sighed, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag over his shoulder as he followed the slow-moving line of passengers through the jet bridge. The weight in his chest hadn't lifted yet. Outside the terminal windows, the Seattle night stretched out, cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the Arizona heat he had left behind. He pulled out his phone and pressed call. It barely rang once before she picked up. "You're safe." It wasn't a question. "I'm good, Mom." She let out a slow breath. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jalen knew that silence. It wasn't relief. It was calculation. His mother was still piecing everything together, still deciding her next move. "Did you eat?" she finally asked. Jalen smirked despite himself. "Mom, I literally just got off the plane." "You need to eat something," she said, and it wasn't a suggestion. Jalen exhaled. "I will." More silence. Then, her voice softened just slightly. "Tell me everything." Jalen shifted his bag higher on his shoulder as he walked toward baggage claim. "You already know everything. I want to hear it from you." Jalen hesitated, then started from the beginning. He told her about the woman at check-in, the way she had stared at him a little too long. He described the TSA officer, the questions, the moment they made it clear they thought something was off about him. His mother didn't interrupt. She just listened. But Jalen could hear it, the quiet anger simmering beneath her silence. When he got to the part where they had questioned how his ticket was paid for, she made a sharp noise in the back of her throat. And when he told her how the TSA officer hesitated when he offered his ID, she let out a slow, measured breath, the kind that usually meant she was counting to 10 before saying something sharp. Finally, he finished. For a moment, there was nothing but the faint sound of the airport around him, baggage carousels humming, voices blending into the background. Then, his mother spoke. "They thought you didn't belong." Jalen swallowed hard. "Yeah." She was quiet again. Then, her voice was crisp, sharp. "I've already requested the security footage." Jalen stopped walking. "Wait, what?" "I have contacts at Sky Harbor," she said simply. "I'll be reviewing it all tomorrow morning." Jalen exhaled. He should have known. "This isn't over, Jalen." "I know." Her voice was calm, but it carried weight. "I don't let things like this go." Jalen closed his eyes for a second. He pictured her, probably still in her office, probably pacing, a hand on her hip. The same look on her face that she had when she was negotiating a deal, when she was taking apart someone's weak argument piece by piece. But this wasn't business. This was him. "You shouldn't have to deal with this," she continued. "Not you. Not anyone else." Jalen sighed. "Mom, I made it here. I'm fine." She didn't respond right away. Then, softer this time, "You shouldn't have had to call me." Jalen felt something tighten in his chest. Because she was right. If things had been fair, if things had been normal, he would have just been another teenager flying to see his cousin. No extra steps. No interrogation. No phone call to his mother to fix something that never should have happened. He sat down on a bench near baggage claim. What happens now? Her voice was steady. They're going to answer for what they did. Jalen let that sit for a moment. Do you think it'll change anything? Another pause. Then, with absolute certainty, it will for the next kid. Jalen exhaled, rubbing his thumb over the back of his phone. He hesitated. I don't want this to turn into something bigger than it needs to be. His mother's voice was firm but warm. Jalen, this was already bigger than it needed to be. The moment they decided you were suspicious for no reason, it was bigger. Jalen didn't have a response for that. A new message popped up on his screen. Malik, you out yet? I'm parked outside. Hurry up before I get a ticket. Jalen stood. I gotta go. Malik's waiting for me. Okay, she said. Then, softer, Jalen? Yeah? I love you. Jalen's throat tightened. I love you too, Mom. Another beat of silence. Then, call me if anything else happens. Jalen smirked. You know I will. Good, she said. Now go. And eat something. Jalen laughed, shaking his head. Bye, Mom. Bye, baby. He hung up and took a breath. The weight in his chest hadn't completely lifted. But for now, it was enough to keep walking. Jalen's story isn't unique. It should be. It should have been just another flight, just another teenager traveling to see his cousin. But instead, it became something else, a reminder that, even when you do everything right, some people will still see you as wrong. And that's the problem. How many more young people will have to prove they belong? How many more will have to call their parents, not for reassurance, but for rescue? Jalen was lucky. His mother had power, influence, and the ability to make people listen. But what about the kids who don't? This isn't just about one bad experience at an airport. It's about the quiet assumptions people make every day. The extra scrutiny. The unspoken biases. The moments that chip away at someone's dignity, piece by piece. So let's talk about it. Have you ever been judged unfairly? Have you ever seen someone else go through it? What did you do? If we don't challenge these moments, they'll keep happening. And that's not a world we should accept. There's a certain kind of exhaustion that comes from always having to prove you belong. It's the weight of being questioned when others aren't, of having to explain yourself for things that should need no explanation. Jalen's story is about more than just one experience at an airport. It's about the way bias, whether conscious or not, seeps into everyday life. For those of us who have lived longer, we've seen the world change. We've watched progress unfold, yet moments like these remind us that some things haven't changed enough. The assumptions people make, the quiet prejudices they carry, these don't just go away with time. They go away when we confront them. It's easy to dismiss a moment like this as a mistake, a misunderstanding. But what if Jalen hadn't had his mother's voice on the other end of the line? What if no one had spoken up? How many young people, how many people in general, face moments like this every day without anyone to advocate for them? We all have a role to play. Whether it's challenging our own assumptions, speaking up when we see injustice, or simply listening with an open heart, change doesn't happen without effort. So let's make the effort. Let's leave behind a world where fewer people have to prove they belong.